and the former Telecoms Media Technology Investment Advisor at the IFC World Bank, which finances many subsea fiber and TMTS projects in developing markets around the world. With me on today's panel, we're very fortunate to have Nigel Bailiff, CEO of Aquacoms, Ian Clark, VP Global Submarine Systems Sienna, Gil Stantalas, sorry about that, Gil, CEO of NJFX, Andy Bax, COO of Seaborn, and Abdullah Al-Sahan, General Manager of International Cables Wholesale Business Unit at Saudi Telecom. Gentlemen, if you don't mind, I don't think there's anyone better to introduce yourselves than yourselves and to tell us a little bit about your background. So with that, Gil, would you like to start, please?
Sure.
Tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. My name is Gil Stantalas, and I'm the CEO and founder of NJFX. We're a carrier-neutral cable landing station in North America, home to 4 subsea cables, and home to 7 terrestrial networks and 25 carriers. We've created a community of interest, a community of resilience, of network architecture that makes sense, and the new age of subsea architecture, the ability to interconnect your subsea assets directly at the cable landing station in a hub environment.
Great. Ian?
Thank you, Lorraine. Ian Clark, heading up the submarine solutions at Sienna. Sienna are the #1 supplier of bandwidth for submarine cables, have been for a number of years. We work globally across all of their operators and web scale providers. And our solutions are aimed at very simply simplifying the network operations and driving down the lowest cost per bit, and working very closely with all of the partners around the world. I'm very proud to be on the webinar, so thank you.
Thank you. Gil? Oh, sorry, Gil, we did already. Andy?
Hey there, Andy Bax, Chief Operating Officer of Seaborn Networks. So I've been building and operating subsea cables for, well, 23 years now, so I'm aging myself. But at Seaborn, we operate Seabrass 1 cable between the US and Brazil, and we also operate networks across Latin America, delivering capacity and IP, predominantly in the wholesale market. But we're spreading across Latin America now as part of our network, delivering low latency, high capacity services across the Americas, north, south, and soon to be central as well. So good to see you all. Happy to be on the panel.
Great, thank you. Abdullah, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yes, please. This is Abdullah Samhan. I am working in Saudi Telecom. I am 30-year experience in the telecom and industry. I leading now SIMI 5 MC chair. STC was main contributor on all these SIMI cables series. This is the route from South Asia to Europe, SIMI 1, SIMI 2, SIMI 3, and SIMI 5. So I am now presenting SIMI 5 as MC chair to talk about the SIMI 5 progress and upgrade and other new project in our region.
Wonderful, thank you, Abdullah. And Nigel, last but not least.
Hi everybody, Nigel Bailiff. I'm the CEO of Aquacoms, and I'm also the Vice Chair of the Smart Cables Initiative from the UN. In Aquacoms, we run submarine cables across the Atlantic. We focus on the Atlantic market. We have 2 cables at the moment, 3 going live this year. And I've done this a bit like Andy for 20 or 30 years, although obviously I'm much younger than I look. I seem to be the only one who doesn't look anything like my PR photo on the invite as well. So well done, chaps, on not growing a beard in the COVID crisis.
Very good, gentlemen. Thank you so much. So we're very fortunate to have these industry veterans on our panel today. With that, I'd like to toss out the first question for discussion. Let's see, how about Nigel? Why don't you each talk a little bit about what are the most exciting projects that you're working on at the current time in regards to geographies, capacities, markets, etc.?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're finishing off this year the what we call America's Europe Connect 2, which runs from the US over to Denmark and branching into Ireland. We have our original cable, which lands from Long Island, into the northwest of the Irish Republic. The reason it does that is for resiliency. It's the shortest distance across the continental shelf to get to a European country. And we have a couple of cables across the Irish Sea, one of which has been live for for 8 years actually this year, and one which is going in the water this year, and then a cable across to mainland Europe from England, from Newcastle. Those projects are developed over the last 2 or 3 years. Cables take 2 or 3 years to get into a deployable state. I think for me, what's interesting about the industry is we're seeing a renewal phase. I've worked in the Atlantic, like Andy and a number of the others, for quite a long time, and the Atlantic's gone through a fairly severe 20 years in terms of the dot-com boom and bust of the 1999 to 2001 series. A lot of assets coming into the market for cents on the dollar, and even cents on the dollar over various restructuring processes. So there's been a kind of an odd market in the Atlantic for a long time, but it's also a hugely high growth market with enormous growth curves, driven by everything. Every piece of data, every social media activity needs to drive itself across that ocean between the North American and European powerhouses. So I think it's an interesting market because people shy away from it sometimes because it's had such a tumultuous past. But with the right approach and the right structure of an organization, partnering with the right people, the people who need enormous quantities of data, I think we've got a fairly stable viewpoint now of what's happening. Other markets for us are going to be to see the interest in branching out from Europe into the northern latitudes maybe, or some unique routes that are still yet to be deployed in the world. We've been building cables for 160, 70 years, and we tend to follow similar paths because those are the generally required paths for data to migrate. But there are opportunities now in technology to deploy cables elsewhere, and I'm keeping a keen eye on some of those because we, as well as operating our own assets, we will operate assets for others. So there are a number of financial or electricity companies that look to deploy submarine cables, and we're trying to work with them in a professional services basis to get the economy of scale that we have from operating and delivering services over them. So I think a great outlook for the sector. Even in current crisis, we've all survived very well. It's been a very flexible and agile marketplace, and we're looking to to move those growths in traffic onwards onto new assets as we go.
Great, thank you. Let's see, how about Abdullah next? You have some interesting projects you're working on as well, yeah?
No?
We can hear you now.
Yes, can you repeat the question?
We're talking about the kind of projects that you're working on that are really interesting at this point.
Okay. Actually, now we are managing the Semi-5 upgrade. And for the region in Middle East, actually, a lot of initiative and for new project like Semi-6, and there is Peace Cable. And for last thing, which it is actually a sign and coming on the force, it is to Africa. To Africa cable, it is very big cable, huge cable system. It's around Africa. It have two portion, one East Africa and West Africa. Both go from South Africa to Italy and France and to UK. Initial design of this system, it is 8 fiber pair, and now they are party looking to extend this one to 16 fiber pair, plus extension of this cable to the Gulf. So STC part of 8 member on this cable system. And this, I see it is the biggest and most excited cable system because it's very long and huge capacity on that.
Coming from the IFC World Bank, that is a very exciting project, because what that means in terms of developing connectivity in that region. So that's a super exciting project. Glad to hear about that.
So 23 country will be landing in 23 country in East and West Africa.
And also eventually up to Europe, is that correct?
Yes, in Saudi Arabia, we are landing in Yanbu city, which is different than Jeddah, north of the Jeddah. Just on that cable system as STC, because we have some mega project and development in Saudi Arabia, and we have this what's called vision of Saudi Arabia 2030, and to different development area. It's called NEOM area also.
Interesting. Yeah, that will be an interesting new smart city development, and will require huge amounts of backhaul capability for sure. For sure. Andy, anything you're working on that's really exciting right now?
Yeah, I think you know, I mean, Nigel mentioned that, you know, Atlantic's going through a bit of a resupply phase, I guess you might call it, where you know, you got to. It's not, you know, our industry is not just about building new routes and reaching new places. It's also we have to maintain that global infrastructure in terms of route maintenance, and route maintenance can mean, you know, keeping older cable systems going. It can also mean resupplying that capacity and bandwidth across those routes. Latin America, where we're focused, it's actually just gone through that phase. So it's actually a really interesting time for us in Latin America, where we've gone through that resupply phase, specifically on the East Coast. West Coast has just added another cable. Google's added another cable onto the West Coast, which is much needed in the region. And now we're seeing, you know, projects we're working on. You know, there's a lot of cooperative projects going on right now. You know, developing and deploying an infrastructure across a region. No one operator can do that on their own. You know, if you know, so we're deploying out right now our IP layer across the region, not just Brazil, but Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, you know, other countries that we're also working on in projects soon to come. But, you know, they're all partnerships. You can't do it on your own. No one operator can. And what we've seen is, you know, beyond that build phase where several new cable systems have been built, there's now much more cooperation than maybe there was in the past in the region. It was a very competitive environment. It still is very competitive. But I think there's a realization, especially over the last few months, that there is a need to work together on these. One exciting project we've got about to complete actually is, and it's kind of along that vein, we're about to finish the activation of fiber capacity that we own on the American Mobile system, owned by American Mobile out of Mexico, but throughout, you know, a regional system that goes throughout Latin America and up to the US. And we'll be activating that, you know, our fiber capacity on that in the next 3 to 4 weeks. It'll create a ring environment for us up and down the East Coast of Latin America and North America, which we're excited about. But it's, you know, importantly, it's an indication of that ability for, you know, often competing operators to work together on different projects, you know, in order to deliver the types of services that Latin America as a region needs. It's not a developing region. But it's not a developed region yet. So there's a lot of work to do in this part of the world.
Absolutely. According to the UN, it's that whole region, Latin America, with very few exceptions, is either a tier 2 or tier 3 region in terms of development and their ability to acquire developmental funding. So being able to deploy such a cable is really exciting, because what that means for the operators and actually the end users within those various Latin American markets. So that's really, really exciting. That's great. Ian, do you want to touch on anything? I know you work with a lot of different clients, so do you have a few words you want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are many different interesting projects around the world, and wherever you sit in the world, clearly you have a preference for that being the most interesting project. I do fully agree with Andy that all of the cables we've got, whether they be new or whether they be existing, are in a constant updating phase, and you're trying to drive cost out of that network to compete. So what we see is a combination of new routes being supported by existing cables. They are complementary. A nod back to Andy with, people do collaborate more these days, but what we've seen from the Sienna standpoint is the launch of the next generation of silicon, which is driving faster rates across the cables, and really just driving down the cost, and being able to launch the first 800 gig solutions with WaveLogic 5 and actually getting those deployed in the challenging environment that we're in today. And I think a lot of people talk about COVID and the supply chain. I think it's been much harder to get people in the right place, by the way, than what it has been to get the products and the actual components there. Getting people in locations and turning up systems, be it through challenges with getting equipment through customs, to getting qualified staff into the right locations to turn equipment up. So if you're asking me what the most interesting things happening today, I would say it's delivering next generation products. We're talking 400 or 500 gigabits per wavelength on the Pacific, but delivering them with intelligence and automation. And I'm hoping we're going to talk about AI and machine learning later on.
We will.
But trying to ensure that we've all picked up on the challenges of getting people in the right place, and it's a perfect time to consider the benefits of automation, simplification, because sometimes in life you don't foresee the challenges of putting people in the right place. So interesting, automation, simplification. There we go.
That sounds great. And we will come back to the technology aspects a little bit later on. Gil, how about you? What are you working on? That's super exciting at this point.
There's a slide that I shared that if we can put on the screen, might be helpful.
Very good. I think Liz has that. There you go.
So here's an example of the first phase of what NGFX has coordinated. We are a community of the carriers that are on this panel and many others that have physical assets that need to be interconnected. So what we've done is really created this group of interested parties that are best of breed at what they do. So consider Aquacom, to Nigel's organization. When they enter into the US, we have a welcoming committee for them. Ones of those that could provide them the connectivity they need across North America. They could also partner with them like Seaborn and Andy that can get them down into South America. It's really a way to interconnect the world in a planned and organized fashion. So having this community and not competing with our customers. And then on top of that, they'll appreciate this. We don't charge recurring fees for cross connects. It becomes a very economically sensitive way to grow their business and have them make additional investments and have reach without having the capital. So connecting ZenFi with Andy at Seaborn, having CenturyLink support the Epsilon network into the capillarity it needs in North America, having Cogen provide its robust IP backbone and be able to work with TI Sparkle that's got an incredible IP global backbone and be able to peer to NGFX provides them again the support that they need. The last piece I'd highlight here is DKICs. So traditionally cable landing stations are quiet places, not with the kind of density that you see here in front of you, but the idea of having an internet exchange physically at a cable landing station allows for the performance unseen before. The only other place in the world that I can think of would be Marseille, France, which has created this hub environment between the Middle East and Europe and has become a gateway. NGFX is the new hub. It's the new standard. It's purpose-built. It's not an accident. It's not an old office building that was repurposed to become a hub. It's really a tier 3 facility, cable landing station that supports interconnectivity models and allows this community to be able to grow their business in a predictable fashion. Really proud of what we have and the team that we have doing this. We spent a lot of time traveling globally prior to this. Spent a lot of time socializing niche players in Latin America with niche players in Europe. And the next time this slide goes up, you're going to see a whole new level of carriers not yet seen before, European-based fiber providers at NGFX, Latin American IP providers at NGFX, and creating a new layer of interconnection not seen before.
Well, that's fascinating. That's really, really exciting. It's game changing, right? So I think we should go back to like Ian's question or topic of discussion around new technology. So it seems to me that Gil, by deploying NJNX, you have been able to set a new standard, as you've said. The concept of having an IXP based at the landing station is quite new. So you've deployed a combination of traditional technologies under one roof, which is creating a new standard. Ian, do you want to talk about some of the standards that are going to be going into that hub? And maybe Gil and Ian, maybe you want to kick us off on your thoughts about the wave of the future regarding new technology standards going forward for subsea fiber.
Okay. Gil, do you want me to go first, or what's your preference here, mate?
Take the lead and I'll follow up with an application on broadcasting, but AI might be a good one for you to start with.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, many people talk about AI as a buzzword, and will it fit into the submarine community? And I think it's just, first of all, it's important to understand what we all mean by AI. Sometimes it becomes machine learning, or is it truly artificial intelligence? So if we were to break that down a little bit, what we're trying to say is, can we examine or sense the network, right? You're not looking at something which is reactive. You want to be proactive. So you need to have telemetry. Well, you need to, first of all, have sensors in the network to actually get that information where you can start to look at it and abstract it. So you've got those. Then what you need to do is consider what you want to do with the information that you're pulling apart. Now, if we break that down into the simple idea, it's we're checking the performance of the repeaters on the seabed on a permanent basis. And what you're trying to do is understand if there is a problem that is starting to appear. It's not damaging traffic, but you're looking forward in time such that you can adapt the network so that the traffic and the customers are never impacted. So you could be looking at a potential failure where you would schedule a maintenance window, or you would be routing traffic in a certain time around. Now, another concept is we build our systems for 25 years life, design life. They don't start out in a form where they finish. The systems vary slightly. So we design our products for end of life. So you're designing it for 25 years, but you're building so much over capability right at the start. So does AI or machine learning allow you to do something hotter? Does it run more capacity day one? Does it fit in a smaller network day one? And then you augment it in an automated process as the system evolves. All these concepts really fit into like a closed loop automation, the adaptive network. And its idea is to take all the learning, process it, and make the network as optimized as possible from day one through to day end, whatever that would be, right? Instead of designing it from day one for end of life and losing all the benefits at the front. So Sienna talks about an adaptive network, but what we have to do is embrace that in our community and ensure that we are relaxed about letting machines do some changes to the network. You know, we're going to look at sharing of repeater pump powers now when we do SDM cables, where you share them across multiple fibers. Are you comfortable relaxing things when your one device might be across two different customers? If we're talking spectrum, are you comfortably moving channels around in a part of a spectrum to optimize it when you've done a rigid deployment day one? So these are all inside the network, and the idea is to drive benefit to the edge of the network where Gil would come on board in terms of his data center, and what you're looking at is the most optimum traffic capacity to drop into your data center, Gil. So I'll pause at that point.
Sure, thank you. I agree. You know, AI is an application. There's many good applications that are all possible with the connectivity that this panel puts together and coordinates. Another application that I think will be front and center for the foreseeable future is broadcasting. Everyone mentioned 20, 30 years in this industry. 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have broadcasters, fast channels, 2, 3, 4, 5. Today, we've got thousands of potential broadcasters, content that's fluid, And there's companies that are out there that are becoming very good at delivering that broadcasting feed, creating content in a way that people are going to be invigorated to want to be a part of events. You know, here we are virtually at ITW, which used to be a 7,000 person conference. I was on a call late last night with the folks from PTC that would have an incredible venue for us to go to again next year. And I'll let them share at some point the next steps of PTC. But if I can't go, I want to feel like I'm there. And broadcasting lets you do it. And you need that connectivity to make it work. So now the application sits on top. The application has to be cost effective. It's got to be resilient. It has to have the least amount of hops as possible. And we all want to see it. So having it at the right place that you can kind of coordinate broadcasting applications and making the world a smaller place virtually, I think will be a killer app in the next years to come. IoT is just another layer on top, right? It just means more places, more connectivity. We're all the arteries and the hubs and spokes, but I think with IoT, the capillarity will be unprecedented as that and 5G takes off, and we're all part of that system that's actually growing.
Fully
Absolutely.
agree.
Andy, any comments? Abdullah?
So
Nigel?
I have, those that have seen me on panels before have probably heard me bang on about this a few times now. But, you know, when you look at, you know, there's cable systems and there's networks. And oftentimes we forget what the difference is. So, you know, transatlantic, as Nigel said, he's got 2 routes, or very shortly he'll have 2 routes across transatlantic. But there's many other cables across the Atlantic too. And if you look at, there's almost like 2 models today. You know, the large content hyperscale OTTs, whatever you want to call them, the big guys, you know, they've got the model where they're on 3 or 4 routes, 3 or 4 cables across all these network routes. And that's the right model, because you need diversity, you need resilience, you need to be fault resilient, not just fault tolerant. But then as cable operators, which is what some of us are, you know, we need to look at that in the same realm as well. And today we have, you know, you look at Latin America as an example, but it's not just Latin America, it's transatlantic, it's trans-Pacific, it's inter-Asia. You know, there are several cable systems between North America and South America. They all stop in different places, but as networks, they are all somewhat interconnected physically. But if one of those cables fails, if you're an OTT or a content provider, a large-scale hyperscale provider, you're absolutely fine, because you've spread your load across 3 or 4 cable systems, and you're not running at 90% on all of them. You're running at low percentage figures, so you can carry all your traffic across the remaining cables that are still there. If you're a cable operator and you happen to be operating the cable that fails or has a cable cut, in most cases you're out of service, and all your customers are out of service. You know, completely agree with what Ian's saying about AI within the network. But I think we've got to take a little bit of a step back as an industry and as a group of operators, and recognize that we're actually behind the ball in terms of just simple things like, you know, SDN, which a few years ago was a magic word. It's not a magic word anymore. It exists. The ability for us as operators on network routes, not cable systems, but routes around the world, to be able to pass traffic automatically between ourselves in order to maintain services across that route. As an industry, we kind of owe that to our customer base. We owe it to our customers to maintain their service even when our cable goes down. Even if that means it's getting carried on somebody else's cable, it shouldn't matter. I mean, it should be, we're delivering a service, and we should be delivering, I guess the underlying message is we've got to get to a point where we're delivering network routes and not cable systems. And that's, you know, SDN can do that for us, technology can do that for us. You know, moving patch codes manually, that doesn't work anymore. That doesn't work for customers anymore.
No, I agree. I think alongside that, there's a whole range of things that we can perhaps use AI to help inform us, or certainly force multiply our intelligence when it comes to doing certain things. And some of that might be route planning, you know, complicated reviews of of deep seabed bathymetry and understanding where to put cables. And at each level in the structure, you know, the foundation level maybe of submarine cables, and then layering networks on top, and then the internet, and then, you know, etc., service layers on top. You can always have a multiplication provided by good artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence usually involves shipping a lot of data to a place where you can compute it into something that's meaningful and can help you. And I think that's where our colleagues and, you know, friends and customers and partners in the big content industry have been very successful in building out their networks to do that, so that they can make good value-based decisions and make those decisions based on data. I think we also have to remember, though, that we connect, we sort of physically connect with the earth, and, you know, there's when a cable is cut, it's a long involved process to send a ship from one side of the Atlantic or the other, or wherever it's, you know, picking up spare cable, and to go to that location and to pull the cable up and to repair the cable, add in some extra new cable, put it back down. This is not about, you know, being able to do something in milliseconds or seconds or hours or days or even sometimes weeks. It can take weeks and months. So we do have to work collaboratively to craft, as Andy says, these different layers that are reliant on each other, but also tolerant of each other's own particular physical issues. It's 5,000, 6,000 kilometers across the Atlantic. It doesn't get, you know, fixed overnight by some techs being put on, you know, rapid duty. So it's, you know, using things that help us predict problems, avoid problems, fix problems quicker, you know, all of those uses of AI are really good. And I think Ian's company they produce a lot of information now from the data that their machinery generally produces, and it makes the job of a value judgment person, an experienced person in a NOC or in a network engineering function, it makes their job so much easier, or they can do so much more than they could 20 years ago. But I don't think we're ready to sort of turn off the lights and all go off to our villas and just let this whole thing hum along in the background. There's a lot of hard work and, you know, real spanner and hammer work needed in making these networks work.
Great. Thank you, Nigel. Listen, we already have our first question, so I'm going to toss this one out, and let's see. First question. Some of the routes are very competitive, and price reduction push the subsea companies to be more effective. Is it time to rethink the classic model of submarine cables? Will we need improvements on the industry that will allow companies to become more efficient? Ian, do you want to take that one, or Abdullah?
Okay, maybe I will take this one just now. Yes, and the model actually, the old model, which it is running by SEMIWE series, you remember, like SEMIWE 3, it have 19 party. So when we have some meeting, it's like United Nations, we have meeting before. So the situation, it is changing now, and to make the thing better and flexible and easy decision. So the consortium model, they try to reducing their member the consortium, and they are succeeded on that way. So in every series of this cable, the consortium members start minimize, and now in the big cable system like which we have mentioned, it's only 8 party, which has a very big cable system. So the model, it is changing now, and it is driven to minimizing the number of the party. This one, the change in the consortium model, also for investment model, which it is before also developed, before it was like MIU kilometer, and then move to wavelength, and now to principle different half fiber or fiber bare. So there is development also in the investment model on this regard, which helping actually to build a big cable system and give a quick decision for the and flexibility for the party to do upgrade. So the model and investment and number of the party, it is changing with the time. So, and also there is entering a new, what's called a new build, and the OTT, they are now coming to this market. Before, most of this cable system, it is driven by the carrier. Now we see the most of the new cable system, it is driven by the other content provider and leading, taking the leading of this because they have the huge data and big investment on this regard. Also, cable system before terminating only on the landing station. So a new principle now, a change in the cable industry, which it is cable system pop to pop. So no more landing station. Like now, 25, we have the cable system. It is from the pop in Singapore to the pop in France and Italy. So now most of the cable system changing this landing station and try to terminate it in the pop. So these many factor or area which we see it changing in the cable industry.
Absolutely, and that goes to Gil's point that he had made earlier on. Okay, let's.
If I could also add to that answer. So I think pricing is a complicated topic. You know,
Okay.
pricing is not straight line cost based. It's not straight line market based. It's a combination thereof. You know, Nigel mentioned earlier about, you know, some of the companies early on going bankrupt and being bought for pennies on the dollar for their capacity. Well, their cost basis is going to be much less. They're going to operate at a margin that others really can't. And then when we start looking at market-based pricing, it means how exclusive did you create that asset? Do you have something that you've created so unique that you can really control the price? The market eventually does dictate what things will be paid for. Having environments where you've got scale allows a better cost basis, and then the market can react and they can turn around and say, okay, I'm willing to discount. I've got a volume game I'm going to play. I'm creating value somewhere else. So ultimately, how much value did you create? Do you have something that's really unique? Do you have scale on what you've gotten? Can you manage your costs effectively? And does it make sense for me to really monetize a certain location? It's not black and white in terms of how it works, but I think as the market continues to grow, you're going to start to see new hubs develop, new locations where people will say, okay, here, I'm willing to create pricing that's going to be very competitive. Somewhere else, I'm going to hold on to my margins.
Got it.
I
Great.
mean, I would say that, you know, is our industry changing? Absolutely. Is it changing at the speed that some people would like? Well, I think you've got to look at it holistically. It can take 4 or 5 years from the concept of a cable being, you know, an incubator to it being delivered. So what is their expectation of the evolution of the industry? If we just pause for a second and you look back to the traditional consortia of CME 3 and CME 4, many members in it were all had to come to the same conclusion to go and deliver an upgrade or a selection. And that slowed things down. Then you had, that's why we had global operators who built their own private networks, and their ability was speed. You know, once they got the financing in place, they could react much more quicker than those traditional consortia. So then what we saw was the evolution of web scale, who were driving bigger, fatter, but really they were trunk services. You know, the Googles and the Facebooks of this world are driving cables which are very much express-only routes between data centers, because, you know, 20 years ago, we were building systems at the voice market, right? Back into the big central offices of the major cities. Now we're going to DCs which are not in the cities. So we've seen that. And then you're now seeing consortia cables still being built, but the construction and maintenance agreements for those are allowing individual ownership rights of fiber pairs, so they can act as a virtual private operator on each of those, and they get that velocity back. We're also seeing some changes in the traditional consortium models where they're actually allowing individual upgrades within that consortium model as well to try and get the velocity. So I would argue that our industry is changing rapidly. If you think of it in what it takes to build a cable, I would argue that what we need to change now is understand where we're building new routes, which are predominantly being driven by capacity and volume, but it's our obligation to the communities as well. Those capillaries, those less served locations of the world that hypothetically could get bypassed because they're not on these trunk routes. So I think we're changing rapidly. Maybe not in all the directions that some people want.
But we shouldn't really knock ourselves for any of that, because if you look at almost any aspect of our wider telecoms industry, local connectivity, fiber to the home, mobile radio development, anything like this. The first private cable in our world came about in about 1989 with the PTAP transatlantic system. That's only just over 30 years ago, right? So that's what we expect to be the length of these assets, the 25-year lifetime roughly people expect the assets to be. So we're only talking about one or maybe two generations of the technology of our industry is the lifetime of this change. So actually, rapidity, when you're thinking about investments that are going to have a 15 to 20-year life, is a different thing compared to whether you buy the next smartphone that's got feature X, Y, or Z on it. We're very different in the base foundation layer of our industry. We're like motorways and railways equivalent. You don't suddenly put another railway into a new town. Towns don't develop that quickly. It's a much longer cycle, and that's where we get put into this industry called the telecoms industry, which everyone expects to have investment facets and investment activities associated with, particularly at the moment, rapid growth, applications development, all of these hugely quick payback, build an application or create something in the digital economy. Whereas in our side of the industry, it's much more around, long-term thought process, utility, infrastructure, core development. And it should rightly have some, there should be some government involvement in that. There should be some, wider UN involvement in that. And we will create the divide if we're not careful, because those with money will build more cables, and there are still many countries with no cables at all.
I do, Nigel and everyone, I do want to come back to the financing aspects of the industry in a few minutes, but we're starting to get quite a few questions, and I think, well, why don't we try to answer some of the questions that are coming in? And then I do want to pick up on how we're going to finance this, what routes are small cables, the economics of financing cables, small versus larger projects, etc. But let me just read the next question that's come out. There's a question around capacity from one of our listeners, and it says, what is the highest capacity wavelength on subsea fiber these days? Is it 200 gigs, 400 gigs? Where is it going? Gentlemen, I'm tossing it out to you. Who would like to take that?
The only way is up, right?
The only way is exponentially require greater bandwidth, that's for sure. Yeah.
We've got some 500 gig actual waves, but then, what does that really mean? I mean, Ian should give us a quick treatise on, channel spacing versus wave capacity. But I mean, the job is just to keep creating more and transferring terrestrial stuff onto submarine and get more out of those assets.
And you were commenting then? Sorry, I didn't want to.
Yeah, I mean, one big difference, obviously, on the subsea side versus terrestrial. Distance plays a huge part too.
Right.
You can't go and upgrade the amplifiers on a subsea cable. Whatever you start with is what you've got. Whatever noise level you start with that's the noise you've got for the life of the cable. It don't get better; it only gets worse. So that plays a huge part. But I think there's transatlantic, there's, as Nigel said, there's 500 gig waves transatlantic right now. Other routes where they're much longer, you're still 100, 200 gig. There'll be routes that are much shorter where, Ian can probably tell us in his crystal ball he's going to be putting a terabit down them in a couple of months.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, It's a simple answer, Lorraine. You would think that the shorter the route, the higher the bit rate you could put on a single wavelength. It's not quite as simple as that, because we don't design the cables in the same form. You design it to a certain OSNR that will carry a cable. And if you use the same techniques on a 13,000 cable versus a 2,000, you've over-engineered the 2,000 one, right? By a country mile. Where are we today? You're going to be able to get 500 gig wavelengths across the Pacific. You can probably get 550, 600s across the Atlantic, roughly, on a card that hypothetically could run 800 gigabits, right? Those are the newer systems. On the older systems, which were not originally designed for the technology we're putting on them today, so it's not perfectly matched, it's trying to address the imperfections, you're still going to be getting 300 gigabits, 400 gigabits on some of them, depending on length. They are much more sensitive to the length of the cable, right? Mm-hmm. But really the question is, it's not how fast can you go? It's a nice metric. Really the answer is, what is the cost of a 100 gig service, not on the submarine cable, between your A and Z endpoints, and if that's pop to pop, you know, that's what you're looking at. You can have the best submarine cable in the world. You could have thrown $200 million at it and got it great, and you destroy that capacity with poor backhaul fiber for 200 kilometers, and you just halve your capacity. So, you know, everything has to be looked at holistically, and that's what we should be looking at.
Absolutely. The economies of scale, and certainly the last mile sometimes is the most expensive portion of any connectivity.
I can comment here, please. Yes, regarding this technology, it has a challenge actually for this consortium cable. You know, when you have some building the system and you put wavelength, so you have high spacing. It is changing the technology using 200G and other. So it is difficult sometimes to upgrade the system and make it very complicated to using high technology like 400 and more, because you have traffic actually in the system, and the system start more complex on this regard. So this one of the challenge actually, which may be facing this consortium cable. And in the SIMIWI series, this is the cases now which we have it in some places. So if you need to upgrade and using new technology, you need to remove all the equipment and make a lot of migration and cost for the upgrade, which sometimes it is not good for the party.
Thank you, Abdullah. There's a question that came in, which I think you're probably best poised to answer, and it's, are there any new cable systems planned specifically for the Gulf region?
Yes, as mentioned to you, there is already now ongoing this Africa, and part of the option to Africa want to extend one branch. Africa, it's have a branch, small branch to Oman, and the consortium is planning to extend this one to all the Gulf, to Bahrain and Kuwait and Saudi and Qatar and UAE and Pakistan and India. So the people are studying this consortium to extend to the Gulf and India and Pakistan.
Very good, thank you. There's a question here that's coming now on lifespan of existing cable. So I'm going to toss this out, and whoever is most knowledgeable on those specific cables, please feel free to comment. What is the expected lifespan for Falcon GCX, SEMIWI 4, IMEWE, and EIG? And also, do you expect routes across Iraq will become major transit routes in the future? Who would like to take that one?
Well, given that I heavily participated in the building of Falcon.
There you go, Nigel, it's yours.
Yeah, but it'll be the same generic answer, which is, do you know what? These The cable systems will last as long as the owner is willing to economically obtain value from them. It's as simple as that. There are, it's the same as backhaul. It's the same in the sea. There are no physical reasons why something should stop working at a 25-year nominal point. Similarly, there are not many reasons why cables might even last that long. And the Atlantic being a heavy traffic market, there were some cables on the Atlantic due to technological differences that lasted, less than 1 decade of, never mind 2.5 decades. But it will all depend upon how hard it is to build a replacement, or how many competing routes, what the traffic volume is, how the commercial structure of a cable works, because if you have paid landing parties, you may not be able to negotiate extensions of the operating agreement. There's a huge myriad of factors, and the fact is there is no answer. The only answer is at some point people will decide generally to retire a cable because its costs or its liabilities will exceed its revenues. And that's happening for a lot of cables now on the Atlantic, coming towards the end of their useful life, because they cannot carry capacity to the same equivalent cost efficiency as some of the new assets. And you'll see those retire. Falcon, I wouldn't guess at. I think we built it in about 2005. It could have a long life yet. It depends even how busy it is. It may well be full of capacity, in which case there's little opportunity to bring in additional revenues, but it may not, in which case there may not be enough revenues to pay the costs of operating it. So each one of those cables you could say all of the same things for, and that's why it's very hard to make a definitive decision, and why consortia have a very hard time agreeing amongst themselves as to when to shut down a cable.
What I would add to that is, not only does the economics play a factor in this, we also have the architecture. 20 years ago, it made perfect sense to land cables in the Atlantic Ocean. They landed in Long Island, they landed in New Jersey, and everyone thought it made sense to go to one centralized location and hand off all that capacity. Well, in the Northeast, that location is called New York City. And New York City today is not what it was 20 years ago. It's not what it was 6 months ago. Aside from COVID and protests, you've got these older facilities that are still there. And when people start pulling back and looking at what they really bought, they say to themselves, I thought I bought on 3 systems, but they all go to one building. They all go to one floor.
It says it, yeah.
It's absurd that, someone thinks they're buying diversity by buying 3 systems and realize they go to the same place with a similar point of failure. It could be a manhole in New York City, where Chicago and Dallas all go down, going to Frankfurt and to Lisbon. So I think it's not just the economics of the cable, but it's the architecture and the poor planning that went into it. If they had thought it through back in the day, they would have taken that cable landing station they had and they would have spider webbed out. They would have taken 5 or 6 routes out. That way they would have invited themselves to have new product to sell, or even better, partner with cable operators that do terrestrial for a living and that are very good at doing it. And then they can have sales channels to sell their services versus trying to be everything to everyone and basically taking on costs they really don't need to, operating risk. So there's a new way of doing things, and these older systems are stuck with this original architecture that I don't think they can change at this point, especially 20 years out.
Well, I think the other key too is there is a, you got to look at the corporate objectives of whether they're cable owners individually or whether they're cable members in part of a consortium. And a lot of the traditional builders of these, these cable systems over the years, they've kind of recognized that their corporate objective is to leverage their domestic networks, their domestic products. They moved away obviously from voice as a large revenue stream. So now there's much more today. You see a build versus buy analysis, and with the larger cable systems, with the huge amounts of capacity they can carry, a lot of these owners of existing cables that have been around for, they may not be more than 10 years. They may have been on a cable system for 10 years. They're now looking at this and saying, well, build versus buy, or in some cases, maintain versus buy. I can buy, the same amount of capacity on a brand new cable that goes, to Gil's point, to where I need it to go, and delivers, better latency, better performance. I can buy, 10x the capacity I get on my existing cable for less than it costs me to maintain that cable. And that's, that also plays a huge part in when do these cable systems get retired.
Yes, I can comment also on this point. Is important because it is not mainly the time or life of the cable. It is mainly how the structure of the cable and the structure. So now, as you mentioned, there is 3 cable, which INW, EIG, or CME4. All their structure, it is symmetrical from beginning up to end. And it is, everything will go to Europe. But all of these cable system now suffering from congestion because all traffic go to Europe from different countries. So most of the segment are not utilized, only the segment between Egypt and Europe. So the structure of the cable sometimes force you to have another cable system because there is physical or problem on the structure of the cable system. So it is not life of the cable or the timing. It is mainly due to the congestion and bottleneck in last segment. So this one of the disadvantage actually of the design of the cable, this in consortium, which have the symmetrical all the way from Singapore, India, and Middle East, and go on one places. Because when you go in the way, you adding more traffic, but in the end, which it is between Egypt and Europe, you found bottleneck on this cable system very quickly. Maybe within 10-year cable or 15-year, you found it is blocked.
Okay, thank you. There's a question that's just come in around valuation. So let me just throw this one out. I think this one may be good for Ian or for Gil, but whoever would like to chime in. This is from Emra Yurmulza from Amsterdam Internet Exchange. I have a question about cable landing stations. How do you see the valuations of cable landing stations? Will we see new business kind of hubs, such as what Gil has pointed out, going forward, evolving in places such as Marseille, Pierre, and Palermo? What do you see coming up worldwide in the coming years?
So I'll take this one to start. So yeah, Marseille was the jewel of Interaction. Interaction traded out with Digital Realty earlier this year. The high water mark is 32 times EBITDA because it's not easy to create EBITDA and grow an ecosystem at the same exact time. But what they've created in Marseille by taking a World War II submarine repair station and negotiating right-of-ways to get more access to the sea and getting the backhaul providers to come and do best of breed at that facility is exactly what we need to have happen. We need to create these hubs where the arteries of the internet really comes in, the subsea cable landing station. We're doing that at NJFX. It's not an easy process. We're in year 5 at the moment. But we've got land and ability to grow and be able to build multiple hyperscale sites at the NJFX campus, which allow the subsea providers to come to the facility, do their interconnections, have compute also available on site. And we also have spare ducts and bore pipes going to the beach, which allows us to have more subsea cables. So for example, there's a company called Confluence. Industry veteran Paul Scott from Cable and Wireless is developing a new cable that's going to touch all the parts of the East Coast. It's going to grab all the cable landing stations from New Jersey, Virginia Beach, down to Myrtle Beach, down to Jacksonville, down to Boca. Florida has always claimed to be the gateway for Latin America. It's the gateway because it was the only place to stop 20 years ago. The main place the traffic's trying to get to is not Florida. It's trying to get to the Northeast. Andy's got to be able people that land in New Jersey. Why shouldn't this be the gateway for Latin America? That's where the traffic's really trying to go. If you're trying to get to Europe, obviously you land here, you jump on Nigel's cable, and off you go to the next continent you need to reach out to. So the world is changing, and cable landing stations are playing a different role. The ingredients are not easy. You have to have power. You have to have a high elevation. I wouldn't want to invest $1 billion and be in a low-lying area. You know, we happen to have picked a location 64 feet above sea level, 1 mile from the ocean. Unheard of. If the ocean comes anywhere near us, New York City won't exist, and Washington, D.C. will be underwater. So I think cable landing stations are going to take time to build in those campuses, but if they're done right, these are going to be the new hubs for yourselves.
Where do you see the most important hubs outside the United States? So Marseille obviously is huge, Palermo. What are the key other hubs that you think need investment in expansion?
The West Coast of the United States could be a good hub. There's been some challenges in Hillsborough. It's a public-private relationship that you have to create because you don't want to get too excited and gouge your customers when they start feeling good about investing in your community. And I think Hillsborough is a good example of that, and it had to move. You know, Los Angeles, I think, has possibilities in terms of, again, being a good hub. You know, Andy mentioned the Curry cable that Google built, that I think Telecoms has a pair of fibers on now. That's an incredible gateway now to Latin America that could really be used to not only do Latin America, but also a branch off into Asia. So when you start getting places where multiple continents can come together, you've got the opportunity to create this cable landing station network hub effect. In South America, I defer to Andy whether Rio could pull it off or Sao Paulo. I don't know if Praia Grande has the credentials to do something like this. But Osiris could pull this off. I know the Ella-Link cable is trying to do something unique between South America and Europe. But when you start to get multiple cables in from continents, the ingredients start to, actually Fortaleza could be an example, right? They got their cable sail, they've got the other cable, can't think of it, that goes between Fortaleza going over to Cameroon and to Angola, the wax cable. So those are the kind of ingredients I would look for to invest in creating a hub for cable landing stations and subsea architecture.
Got it. Ian, do you have any particular statement?
I suppose it depends what you really want out of a hub. If it's an optical inflection point, which is Fortaleza, really, where you are cross-connecting trunk cables, great. But you've not got a delivery of data there with a huge data center, right? So you've got to separate what you're trying to achieve. You've got a massive amount of data being delivered in Marseille. If you look at Europe, Genoa is deemed to be the next one, where people are trying to get some diversity. If you look at Egypt, you've got a lot of cables going in, but that's because there's a country that you're trying to get through to the Red Sea, and you've got some diversity. Oman is getting quite a few cables now. They're persuading people to invest in there, and they're building a super hub, and I think it's Equinix building a big data center there in Muscat, right? Singapore is, for such a small place, a unique hub of cables, and Hong Kong was fast tracking that way until the permitting challenges, which have caused people to rethink about that. I think you know you have got some great inflection points in terms of cables, but if we're looking at bringing to a location because of the data center and the desire to have serve that location with a lot of local data and storage, i.e. for the Facebooks and Googles of this world, then you've just got to still consider what is the cost of running that data center, power and space, and then stability in the bedrock and getting cables in there, right? I mean, if you've got a lot of shallow water, then the cost of the cable becomes very expensive when you're going to put it in there, right? There's many different scenarios, I would say. And Nigel's got his hand up.
I think
Well,
Nigel
I'm just saying we have to really think about what is a hub. You know, Marseille, there are actually 3 interaction cable landing station facilities in Marseille, not one. I mean, they're just launching a great big new one. That's true, but you know, this is where many things in our industry are actually at opposition with each other. Many of the draws on what and why and how we design things. yes, it would be great to have cables near each other because then they can share, the potential of connecting in disaster scenarios. But on another hand, it's better to have cables a long way apart from each other because then they won't get hit by the same natural disaster or the same errant ship's anchor or whatever. So concentration is good, but concentration is bad. I mean, it's a classic sort of goal seek. And so, you don't want one hub, you want a series of hubs that are diversely spread. If you look at the western coast of Europe, we now have cables that land in Denmark, Ireland, the UK, France, Spain, and Portugal with Ellalink. So, is any of those a hub? Well, potentially. Ireland has 3 of the new era cables landing in the Republic of Ireland, and there are some major hyperscale data centers there. So, it could be a hub country, but it isn't one individual location or even one individual metro. It's actually, you've got to create the strength of diversity as well as concentration. It's a very complex issue. So I don't think there's a real answer to that question.
Well, and also, I totally agree with what Nigel just said. As Gil mentioned earlier, when you come from a background where people thought they had on 3 different cable systems and ended up landing in the same POP, and if the POP fails, they all go down.
Right.
You can't put together a strategy that basically just moves that risk closer to the beach. So I think there's it's more talking about campuses but a subsea campus can actually transverse several countries. But the important point there is they only work as a campus if there's coordination between not just the cable owners for each of those, or cable consortium or members for each of those cables, but also the national and regional players, whether they be government, regulatory, network operators in those regions, so that you can stitch those individual landings together to create that campus, so you've got that true diversity. So it's a challenging question. It's not easy done, because when these cables get designed, in most regards, people kind of look at where's best to land my cable and what's the better route for my cable, and they don't necessarily always coordinate very well with other cable owners around, and how will we best stitch them all together to create the right network. But it's something that's got to be done. It's got to be worked on harder, but it's a challenging question, definitely.
Absolutely. So one of the questions I wanted to come back to is about, specific shorter, if you would fill in cable routes that are required for both developed and developing markets, and the larger cables and how they're financed, and how they are not only financed, but how the time it takes to get a shorter cable system to market than a longer cable system. Is that something that everyone would like to chime in on here? Because the financing of, and we've talked a lot about consortiums, and it's always about what's best for me. But as we go forward, especially as we're looking to deploy backhaul that will be able to support developing markets, the way that we take a look at these consortiums will be very different. Ian, do you want to?
I don't mind. I don't mind starting on that.
Okay.
Lorene, I think, as you all know, right? I mean, it's, we talked earlier on about how are we developing as an industry in terms of moving forward. I think it's been, a big change has been recognizing, as Nigel mentioned earlier, that these are not traditional networks. This is infrastructure, like a railroad, like an airport, like a hospital. It develops connectivity for countries. It also stimulates growth. We talked an awful lot with the IFC a long time ago around how, cable connectivity into a country drives GDP. Not, and that's a bottom line fact. I mean, it's not insignificant.
2% penetration yields an additional 2.5 in GDP.
There you go, right?
Proven, for sure.
Driving down wholesale capacity costs into developing countries is definitely an enabler for growth for the country as a whole. And what that means is you know, you got to recognize it's infrastructure. There is no short-term gain. It's not a short-term play. In terms of developing the system, although they should be developed a lot faster than they are today in most cases. But also B, in terms of return. You can't look at it in terms of an equity return. It's an infrastructure play. Nobody builds a railroad and expects to, you know, make their money and make a killing in 3 years. It should be no different with these systems. I think also there's a lot to be said for working closer. You know, recognize that, you know, as was mentioned earlier, the large players, the guys building the 16, soon to be 24 fiber cable systems, they're building between major hubs, major data points, major locations. There are hundreds of capillaries that need either building still or renewing and maintaining throughout the world that mean that people can get to those. Because that, you know, that's a huge part of the network, both terrestrial and subsea. And what we see in our region, Latin and Central America specifically, is huge opportunities and huge onus on us, both as operators and developers, but also, you know, in terms of the countries themselves, to work much closer together in terms of developing strong, stable, you know, financially viable models that can mean that you know, whether it be, you know, Peru, whether it be, you know, Antigua in the Caribbean, whether it be Guyana in you know, in the top end of South America, whatever it might be, that they can build a sustainable model to create that capillary, to create that on-ramp and drive that GDP growth. There's a lot more of that I think we can do. I think we're doing better than we did 10 years ago, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, I would agree that the public-private partnership, that type of consortium, I think is needed, especially to fund and deploy on a shorter notice than it's been taking to developing markets, right? Because developing markets, of course, are always lagging the mainstream markets. However, these are the markets where we need to, there's a great deal of natural resources, human resources that need to be developed. And the only way to do that is to provide backhaul.
Well, and, you know, as Nigel mentioned earlier, it's somewhat disproportionate, right? If you're a huge user of bandwidth and you're building a massive cable system across the Atlantic, the Pacific, South, you know, whatever it is, 24 fiber pairs, 16 fiber pairs, your economies of scale make it feasible to build that cable.
Yeah.
Right.
If you want to build a 200-kilometer cable system between two islands in the Caribbean, you're the group that need that economy of scale. That's what's really going to drive benefit, is you getting that economy of scale. You don't get that. What you get is, that's a 200-kilometer system that's going to cost you 4 times more on a unit basis than a transoceanic system.
But I think we're also rubbish at one very important thing. You know, in lots and lots of areas of our industry, people are looking at recycling and how to reuse things. And there's many good stories around the world of submarine cable systems being recycled. You know, the Gemini cable system, very cleverly by Cable and Wireless, was, you know, chopped into pieces, picked up from the seabed after it was decommissioned, taken over to the Caribbean and laid as the east-west system between some of the bigger Caribbean islands. Now, if you take, let's say, any of the Atlantic cables that are in the water now, that, you know, they might well be 20 years old or even older, but they can probably get 4 terabits with a piece of, you know, Ian's whiz-bang equipment per fiber pair. They've got 4 or 6 fiber pairs each, so they're not hundreds of fiber pairs, but a few. Those could easily be redeployed around on smaller projects. And, you know, I did a lot of work a while back with Digicel and with the World Bank and IDB down in the Pacific, trying to find, you know, solutions to some of these island connectivities, because they're on the wrong side of the digital divide. They might be, you know, locations that are 1,000 miles from the nearest next location, and they might only have 20,000 people, but they're seriously missing out. They're the people who could benefit from e-medicine, e-health, e-government, And you know, there has to be a solution here to take some of this asset that is perfectly viable if redeployed, and create some form of, you know, structure of putting this back in the water and getting it to serve those locations, because then we can all happily grow together instead of, you know, just widening this gap between, you know, we've got terabits up here and down here these guys are working on satellite's a solution for some of them, but not for many of them, to be fair.
Well, current satellite systems have, up until recently with the advent of LEO, have been totally cost ineffective, and capacity-wise and latency-wise have not been able to support the likes of 4 and 5G and eventually 6G going forward. The advent of LEO may change that, which would be a positive thing, because we all need alternative routing, both terrestrially, subsea fiber, and fiber in the sky. So that could be a good thing. But to your point here, Nigel, I think the discussion of you know, narrowing the digital divide and issues around sustainability, the ecological issues that we have around fiber. I mean, how viable is it to dredge up an existing cable and repurpose it?
In the deep sea, there are people who are doing that right now today,
right,
to obtain economic benefit from the copper and steel and polyethylene that they're comprised. So it's perfectly straightforward. And, you know, there's at least 2 vessels I could tell you right now are around the coast of Africa or in the Caribbean, pulling up old telegraph cables, 1860s, 1890s, you know, telegraph cables, to harvest the copper inside them. So, but I'm talking about systems that are just recently, maybe, or even still in service. They could easily, once you're out of the shallow water and you're out of the burial and you're away from perhaps damaging coral, it's a very straightforward job to pick up surface laid cables, which you know, we do when we do repairs, and then lay them somewhere else.
I think one real challenge, and Lorraine, you'll know from your background, and maybe talk a little bit about it, is, you know, what often the case, and Nigel mentioned one activity just a little while ago. You know this too, Nigel. You know, it's left to either a cable developer or an operator to try and drive regional development cooperation between multiple countries and governments, and that's difficult. That's difficult for an operator. It's difficult enough for a government. You know, how we coordinate between folks like the IFC, the World Bank, you know, interdevelopment agencies, whether they're regional or global. How we coordinate better to make sure that, you know, if somebody has a great idea and a feasible idea to bring, you know, several countries together with a regional system to create that capillary onto these huge cables that are being built by the larger players, how do we better marry that drive with the abilities of regional and global organizations to encourage that regional development effort? How do we make that work so that it's not the likes of, you know, me and Nigel paying visits to 14 different islands to try and get them all on board and convince them all it's a good idea? And by the way, by doing that, you do drive economies of scale, because now you're not building one 200-kilometer system, you may be building a combined 10,000 kilometer system. So now you can drive economies into that.
I think you'll find that the international, or the DFIs, the Development Funds Institutes on a global basis, are looking to the industry to come up with solutions. I think this is a phenomenal solution that you're already working on, but the bar needs to be raised at a higher level at the level of like the UN and the World Bank.
Absolutely.
And these institutions have the capability of making this happen, certainly around public-private partnership funding and coordination in developing countries. So I think perhaps maybe that's an action item we can take within the subsea industry to make sure that we get the attention of both the UN and the World Bank going forward, because this is an ecologically and economically sustainable solution to providing connectivity relatively quickly to some challenging parts of the universe right now.
I mean, we have some momentum, Lorraine. I mean, over the last, 4 months, how many governments have actually declared telecommunications infrastructure as being critical infrastructure?
COVID has forced that. You're absolutely right, Ian.
So,
Now is a very opportune time to push home that message.
it would be criminal if we didn't then leverage and maintain that momentum.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge we face right now, to maintain
I think
that
that's
momentum.
an action item that I will help to facilitate all of you moving forward. How's that? I think that's really important.
Fantastic.
And one item I would add to the conversation is the low interest rates that we're currently in. I mean, you've got capital in your home. There's nowhere to put your money to get reasonable returns. And I think infrastructure is a great word. The funds that are out there willing to support, equity investments are looking for long-term outlook on where to put their money to work. So if you have a proven developer and a proven operating team, I think there's a home for you to work with some of these large infrastructure providers that want to invest, want to put their money to work. The sovereignty issue obviously is a difficult one, but that's where I guess other international organizations have to get the risk mitigated in terms of that capital being tied up in a foreign entity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a couple more questions that have come in, and I'm just cognizant of the time. We have 5 more minutes. So I would like to get to these 2 questions before we sign off. This has been a really interesting discussion. The next question has to do with mass production and lowering the cost of light equipment. Will we be able to reduce the light up project duration, so the timing, because time is money, and what difficulties, what are the difficulties in mass production in the subsea industry? Well, we talked earlier about the fact that, the consortiums and the cables and the criteria, the money behind it, but would someone like to take this in terms of how can we reduce the time to light up projects?
Yeah, come on, Ian. Why did it take so long?
Well, let me give you a couple of examples first. So, Seabrass 1's 10,500 kilometers long, and it took us 18 months from start to finish to manufacture it, build it, implement it, and turn it on. And that was largely driven by permits. The permitting process was 18 months. We're currently looking at a system that's 500 kilometers long. Deployment time is 18 months. It's got nothing to do with manufacture. It's got nothing to do with installation. It's all to do with permits.
Got it. And that is something that potentially some of the
this one main actually challenge for this industry, the permit now, with the situation, political situation. So this big challenge actually for this industry, as mentioned by our colleague, it is not a problem of production. The supplier ready to produce a huge amount of or create a production line for the cable and other thing. But main problem actually the operation and the permit and working in different country. So this one of the main challenge, maybe take it as internationally to make for the government to facilitate and make easy for this industry to supporting all this country and industry.
And then in terms of just lighting the systems, it really depends what state the cable is in. Is it new and not actually carrying live traffic versus an existing?
You're assuming the question is assuming it's new. Yes.
Assuming it's new. I mean, look, the vast majority of people who supply upgrade equipment, Sienna being one of them, we're on mass manufacturing where we're making thousands of cards a month, right? Whatever the application, terrestrial, subsea. So it's at the project plan, which is delivered, and you can upgrade a system point to point from purchase order to acceptance within a quarter, 12 weeks. It's not a problem, go and get that done. It's the project timelines, whatever the testing duration. Some people want 2 days, some people want 2 weeks. Customs varies massively per country. It can take you 2 or 3 months to get into certain countries. You can get them in the space of a week in other countries, right? So automation is certainly speeding up the actual testing of it, the supply chain is mass manufactured, it really comes down to our desire to want to get things done at a certain speed. So I don't look at them as the barriers.
No, and I think also, you know, Louis, if you're talking about new systems, it's really about bringing all the piece parts together. It's not just the cable, it's not just the, you know, the ins equipment. It's the building, it's the cable station, it's the data, because you're not delivering station to station, it's pop to pop. So it's
Yeah,
the
right.
backhaul, it's the terrestrial network, it's coordinating all of that. And that is not, you know, that's not the role of Ian's group. That's not the role of an Alcatel or a TE Subcom or whoever it might be, a turnkey supplier. That's the
Right.
role of the developer and the operator.
Yeah.
Having all those piece parts in place so that, you know, one key element of the whole project, and when we look at subsea systems, is okay, what they call the final splice date? When's the final subsea splice go in so you can power on the cable and have the ability to light it? You know, I've seen projects where, you know, Seabrass 1, final splice, we were actually passing traffic 2 weeks after final splice. I've seen projects where it's been a year after final splice because the cable station wasn't ready, or they'd not built the
Yeah.
backhaul yet, or there were no pops.
Mhm.
You know, it's all about planning, proper project management, understanding all the piece parts, and making sure that, you know, you got feet on the ground throughout the process so that you don't drop the ball somewhere and not be able to turn that system on when you need to. Just like you said, at the end of the day, you know, time's not only money, it's also service. And it's
Absolutely.
delivering those benefits as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, this has been a phenomenal discussion. There's one last question and then that from one of our viewers. So I want to ask that. And then I just have a closing question for all of you. We've gone past an hour and a half. It's been an amazing discussion. We could all obviously talk for hours and hours and hours, and I hope we have the opportunity to do that in the future face-to-face very soon. But just last question from the audience is, what have you seen in your respective businesses, any uptake regarding COVID-19 specifically in your businesses?
I'll
Yeah.
take a shot at describing that. So what I've seen is that everyone's been working from home and feeling comfortable and managing networks from somewhere afar. But being at a cable landing station, being facility-based, we've seen the employees of all the companies that everyone here works for working tirelessly to try and put up new capacity. There's been new challenges. We've been working under Code Orange for the last 4 months, and it's not been easy, but we've not missed a beat. It's everyone feels like we've transitioned, but what I would challenge this group to think through is that we're still in the middle of an emergency. In this continent, we're having protests on a national basis every day. And the techs that work for you and the vendors support you are all going through not an easy time period. We had a nationwide outage last week with a mobile operator in the US that I'll remain nameless, but we are stressing what we're doing. It's not easy. And we're testing the systems put in place. We've accelerated the adoption to the cloud and the use of the networks that you guys all provide. And now we're going to find out how resilient these networks really are. It was mentioned before about local private partnerships. You know, when we worked with Nigel and his team, we played an active role in helping them when they came to New Jersey to figure out how to get accommodated with the local politics. Because yes, all politics are local. And as a cable station operator and owner, we play a role in those politics to try and help our community get those projects done on time and keep the networks working when things aren't as easy to do.
Got it. Listen, gentlemen, including COVID, I just some final comments from all of you. I'm going to ask you, including COVID, what are the most important issues that you see within within the industry and your respective companies within the next 12 to 18 months?
I can start. So first of all, you know, within our company and specifically within our region, you know, I just say to all of our, especially all of our employees who have been fantastic, but our partners, our suppliers, our customers in the region, and Latin America is not on the downward spiral of COVID. It's on the upward spiral still. It's still a struggling region. It's a real issue there. So, you know, my message to them is, first of all, thank you. And secondly, you know, stay safe, keep doing what you're doing. And together we'll get through what is going to still be a difficult time for them all. but you know, exciting times. I think exciting times are ahead. I think it's uncertain times in terms of what will it look like when finally all the regions are through this. But I think it's going to be a really interesting time in terms of onward development, more capacity. You know, I think as you know, to the earlier question, we saw about a 40% rise in capacity regionally as a result of COVID. It's not changing. It's not going down. If anything, it's going up. But we added huge amounts of capacity in LATAM, which is not, you know, not on the same scale that Nigel would transatlantic. It's a totally different market, but you know, several terabits across the different networks into Latin America was huge during the last 3 months. So, yeah. But that would be my message. So, you know, it's not over for our region yet. We're working through it, and everybody's working together.
Thank you. Abdullah?
Yes, this main message, this critical asset actually, or critical infrastructure for the government and economic. You know, now everybody running the economic from their home and work on that one. So the message, it is need to invest more in this infrastructure and make protection for that infrastructure and long-term planning for the capacity which required for any like this event happen in the future. So this which it is driving us to invest more on this industry and different route and different cables project.
Thank you. And Ian, any comments from you in closing?
Echoing very much Andy's view, people. Everybody's come together. We have an obligation to our employees, our partners, our customers, to ensure that people stay safe and that they are, everything that we ask, they are comfortable in doing. We can't force people to fly and travel if they don't feel comfortable. So we're all looking at, you know, workarounds, resolutions to try and keep everybody happy. We're seeing that, you know, the shipping industry, the new cables is being delayed because we can't resupply those cable ships. So they're going, some of those timelines are going further out. They're missing certain windows, and we're scrambling to put capacity on other routes to offset those delays, right? Not foreseen, no point stamping our feet, but it's like keep everybody safe and comfortable, and in the end, we'll all come out stronger.
Sounds good. Nigel?
My final is that, you know, this takes me back to almost my first days in the industry. The next 12 to 18 months is going to mean more cooperation. Yep. My personal view is it will drive a localization of things away from where we've been globalized recently. And supply chains are going to be considered very, very carefully as we go forward. And what that means is we're going to have to cooperate with people that we might have previously considered, you know, competitors. That's a very common thing in this part of the industry. You often have to work together to build these bedrock-based connectivity paths across oceans to connect people. So that might mean instead of me flying somebody all the way over to New York, I'll work with somebody in the US who's doing something there anyway as part of their natural activity. It's about specialization. It's about looking after your people and keeping them safe. And I'm trying to anticipate what's the next thing round the corner. Is it a COVID-20 or is it something completely different? But to try and make stability in our operating models without us needing to do lots of traveling, without us needing to have lots of our own specialist resources, and to create an economic model that's better together. Because, you know, none of us is an island, and we're going to have to work together to make all this work in this new, you know, post-COVID era.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, I just want to thank you all for this very interesting, engaging conversation on subsea fiber, where we are and where we're going. Certainly COVID has impacted the industry, and it will, the requirements going forward for subsea fire will be global but local, and will require the financing cooperation of both public-private partnerships, traditional operators, telecom operators, and the over-the-top players. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your participation. Liz, I will turn it over to you Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
Lorraine.
Thanks so much, Lorraine, Nigel, Gail, Ian, Andy, Abdullah. Thank you all so much for your contributions. I would like to thank everyone who has joined us for this discussion, and thank you all so much for your questions as well. Just whilst you're here, I wanted to point out that next month we have Virtual Subsea World. So it's running on the 22nd, 23rd of July to connect you with all of your industry peers. There'll be live content and networking no matter where you are in the world. So hopefully one of the takeaways you've had from this week is that there is a lot of value in connecting this way until we are able to do so in person. So I do hope you can join us. Registration's free and you can register through our website. So with that, I think this is actually the final session of Virtual ITW. So just thank you so much for all of the support you've given us this week. We do hope that we can see you again very soon, and stay in touch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.